Would like to begin by saying thank you everybody for joining me for the third webinar of the Historic Venue series. My name is Jessica Knapp. I'm the Online Engagement Coordinator here at Canada's History Society, and I will be your host for tonight's webinar. Tonight, Adrian French will discuss how to heighten student historical, cultural, and political awareness. His presentation will use two projects from his Governor General's award package to show how to integrate historical critical thinking and research skills into lessons, and how to use peer debate and planned ambiguity to help students really understand Canadian history. I explained it to a friend and colleague earlier today. He takes university teachings, what I learned in university for the first time, breaks them down and explains them thoroughly to high school students, which is really an incredible task that he does, and he does well. So before Adrian begins his presentation, I would like to introduce a bit about Canada's History Society itself. And if you've heard this introduction before, bear with me, it's pretty short. Just giving everybody a brief overview of us as a society and the many opportunities that we provide for history lovers in Canada. Canada's History is a national charitable organization dedicated to making Canadian history popular for a general audience. We do this in a number of ways, including our flagship publications, Canada's History Magazine, formerly known as The Beaver, and Kayak, Canada's History Magazine for Kids. Canada's History Society also presents numerous awards each year, two of which are specifically dedicated to teachers, both of which Adrian has been a recipient of. In 2010, Adrian was awarded the Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. This award was created in 1996 to recognize exceptional history educators and to encourage greater collaboration and exchange of ideas within Canada's teaching community. Since 1996, Canada's History has celebrated hundreds of recipients and finalists, while creating a national network of enthusiastic and innovative history teachers. This year's deadline for this Governor General's Award is April 1st, 2015. So if you're thinking about applying, now is the time to start that application. And I'll bring up a slide here. You can find all the information you need for the award at the bottom link on the slide, and I believe if you click it will open up in another window for you. So in 2014, Adrian received the Government of Canada History Award for Teachers. This teaching award asks teachers to submit high school level lesson plans and projects based on one of three themes. This year's themes include Symbols of Canada, World War II, and Canadian Prime Ministers. This award is unique because there are two elements to it, in the sense that it is presented to both students and teachers. So the applicants for the Government of Canada History Award for students are in grade 10 or 11 and are required to submit an essay answering one of the 5 challenging questions about Canada's history. Questions ask students to assess topics such as the legacy of Sir John A. Macdonald and Louis Riel, the impact of the war years on the lives of women, Canada's relationship to the Arctic and its people, how historians assess different primary sources, and what the Canadian flag means to Canadians 50 years after the official unveiling. So the deadline for both students and teachers for the Government of Canada Award is April 17th. So again, now's the time to start working on those essays. To prevent any glitches or lagging over the next hour, close any applications that you don't need to be running right now. That will help with sound and with the PowerPoint. If there are issues, however, there will be a recording of the webinar available later this week on Canada's History's YouTube channel. Again, the link is in the slide if you wish to bookmark it now. If you are on social media, please spread the word about our conversation tonight. I have included both Canada's History's Twitter and Facebook links there. Finally, I will be sending a survey tonight to all of those who have registered, and would really appreciate your feedback, whether you're watching it live or as a recording at a future point. At this time, I will give the reins over to Adrian, and he will begin his presentation.
Alrighty, I got it there. Okay, hey, greetings from Victoria. I'm seeing all you guys' weather reports here, and it's very cold today. We had a little bit of frost on the windshields, and we're hoping that doesn't damage our blossoms too much, but I won't talk much about that. Before we get going, the first thing I'd like to say is that my connection every now and again has cut out for just a few moments where it seems to refresh the connection. I'm not sure why, but if all of a sudden I go quiet in the middle of a sentence, I'll be backtracking to cover that one, and then I'm guessing that Jessica will be able to edit the recording as it goes. So welcome to this conversation on fostering historical inquiry by using debate and focusing on our foreign and domestic policies. And the presentation is going to focus on two projects that I do, but not just going over the projects, but actually taking a look at how we build up to these projects and how we use the projects to help the students understand the decisions that have been made throughout Canadian history. For the PowerPoints, I hope we've made them available to you, so hopefully you have them to make notes on. That would be great. And ask questions. I'm happy to ask questions as we go or save them up for the end. And I'm always happy to ask questions afterwards. My email's included at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. So I'm a lover of quotes, as many people are, and I came across a quote from Simon Sinek, the author of Start With Why, that says, there's no decision that we can make that doesn't come with some sort of balance or sacrifice. And this, in the age group that I teach, which is high school, grades 9 through 12, is something to really struggle with as they take a look at how decisions are made in their lives and ultimately how decisions have been made throughout history. How do we find the balance, and what is the sacrifice? So we're talking about the idea that students looking for balance in decision making, and one of the things that they really struggle with is hindsight, taking a look at what happened in the past and saying, how did these people make these decisions, and couldn't they have seen that there were better options? The answer is that they often made decisions to balance, and that made sacrifices that made sense to them in that moment. And you can only really understand it if we get into that moment. And so we're going to talk about that today. And as we look at it, we're going to look at a number of things. I've infused a bunch of pictures of Canadiana. I'm a great one for Canadiana, and pictures of people making decisions and our struggles to understand them. So we're going to start to talk with looking at historical empathy and what it is and what it's made up of. And then how at Mount Doug we built an environment of historical inquiry and just inquiry in general. And then we're going to take a look at how we've fostered it across grades and across disciplines, and then ultimately leading into the projects that came out of the Governor General's package on how we've applied those ones and practically applied them. And so we're going to continue going through this one, PowerPoint, and taking a look at the first bit, which is this idea of historical empathy. And historical empathy is something that we all strive for, whether we know we're building it into our projects or our lectures or our conversations or our books. This is really what I think most people are going for. And it's the idea of the old cliche of walking a mile in someone's shoes. Really, this is what students want. They want to be able to understand how people could make the decisions that they made 50 years ago, 100 years ago, a year ago. And to do this, we really look for three main things. And the first one being is historical contextualization. And this is important for kids to understand that times were different back in the old days. And that when they talk to their grandparents and they listen to tales, that the perspective their grandparents had was completely different. They might not have walked uphill in the snow both ways going to school, but they had a different view of the world, and that was because of the context that they were living in. For me, I understood this through my own families when I met my grandmother, and she came to live with us, and she's a woman who lived through the Depression, lived through the Blitz in London, and her worldview was very foreign to me, although she was my kin. But it took a long time to understand the context of her life shapes the view she was looking at the world in my time. But I was looking at them through another set of eyes. I didn't have her context. And so as soon as I found that her context, while different from mine, came from her experiences, and my view of the world came from my context, we began having wonderful conversations about her life and about my life. And it was really the start of my getting interested in really digging into history. Now, comes from the perspective taking, where you have to understand another life lived, and what led to these ones. We all have people in our families or our past that we shake our head and go, why did they make those decisions? And unless we actually know the context they came from, we can't get that perspective taking, and actually sitting back with a bit of perspective and saying, they lived their lives and they made decisions as generally rational human beings, and where did that lead to it? And for this, it ultimately leads to this idea of an effective connection, where we can actually begin to see that they were making decisions in the context that they lived in, much in the same way I make decisions in the context that I live in. And with young kids, we're talking about teenagers here who are making a lot of decisions, when they can stop, and it could be a young man's decision to go off to war, and they go, why would they do that? Why would they think that? And they say, but what was their life like at that moment, and why would they possibly make those decisions? And I look at the kids and I can say, well, you're thinking of going out in the world. What are you making? What tools are you using to make those decisions? And what's your context? And as soon as they start to realize that they're making decisions, and a teenager 100 years ago were making decisions, they begin to empathize with them. And this is really what we like. And this is where we get the great Venn diagram that we take a look at, that all of these three elements lead to this idea of historical empathy. And one of the things we're really proud of at Mount Doug is that we build this into all of our grades. And we look to build them through grades 9 right through 12, that the whole time they look at a project or an essay question, like the questions that the government of Canada put forward, is put yourself in the shoes of these people. And often to do that, you have to do the research. And we want to allow them to dig into the research. And it allows them to build this perspective, an effective connection, and understand the program built for our kids to move through all of these three key elements of historical empathy consistently. And it's built into our program, and the slide that's going to help you guys understand what we do is what we do at Mount Doug in Victoria. We work with a cohort model, where we have kids grouped together from grade 9 through grade 12. And in the first 2 years, in grade 9 and grade 10, they take social studies, English, science, and math together as a group. And in grade 11, it moves on to social studies and English, because out in BC, our science is beginning to split off. In grade 11, it's into English 12. And what this allows us to do is to build unified programs 9 through 12. We know who the kids are, we know the teachers for the most part, and we build this program that allows us to build bit by bit by bit on what the kids are doing. And one of the things that we really like about this idea is that it allows us to build a vessel. Often in education, people talk about scaffolding, or people talk about building the kids a stairway which they can walk up in. In Victoria, we take those planks and we have the kids build a vessel or a ship, if you'd like, for them to sail and navigate on their own. So they build this model through the years that they're here, the 4 years that they're out Mount Doug, and we weave in multiple disciplines. So if you're working in my social studies class in grade 9, the project you're working on spills over into the math class, and then spills over into the science class, and then will spill over into the English class. So we're not teaching things out of context. And as they do this, they build a stronger boat that allow them to go on longer expeditions out into the world of historical inquiry and explore more things on their own. All of these inquiry tools are developed and refined over the 4 years. We build layers to their ship that allow them to understand the historical inquiry process more. They're allowed to refine it, and they're allowed to use it again and again and again. It's not that we do a project where they do a little bit of research, and then that's it for research for your high school career. We revisit those again and again and again, and we build layer upon layer upon layer until they've actually got a very strong ship, to keep the metaphor going, that they can set off into the world and off into universities or into the public sectors or wherever they want to go. And on that journey, historical empathy is the overriding theme for us, where we really want the kids to stop and think, why would people make the decisions that they made? And we found it to be very, very, very effective program. Now, the first of the projects to get the historical debate going is a project looking at Canada, Quebec, and the Constitution, and understanding realpolitik. And the kids, once they get this, they really get into this idea that politics is more than what people say. It's the actions that they explore, and actions that they do, and the things that they put in motion. Now, this is a traditional essay, sort of. One of the things we've decided was, in this point, the kids in grade 11 are writing this essay. They already know how to research. In grade 9, they've been exposed to questioning. That the grade 9 course, the main focus is how do you ask a good question. In grade 10, they spend 14 weeks researching people who came to Canada, immigrants, using push-pull themes of geography, but also using the validation, proximity, exploring primary and secondary sources. So in grade 11, we know that these guys know how to research well. So what I decided was, rather than say research a bunch of material, I'll give them text, which is a term called text rendering, where I say, you guys need to cover this material. I use a book by Francis that is called Canadian Issues, and we get the kids in a group of about 4 to 5 kids, and they're assigned different parts of the textbook that cover our Constitution, our laws, some of the parties, political parties that popped up in Canada, looking at Quebec, the FLQ crisis, Duplessis' time of the Union Nationale, and of course the referendums. And they go off and they're looking for material that they might want to add into an essay to use as a direct quote or to develop into their own thoughts. And so the students explore these different positions on the text, and they'll do research on their own. But what I'm asking them to do is to come to class with a position. But each of the students will have a different position, a slightly different position, because they've researched slightly different aspects of the constitutional debates. At this point, they come together in their group, and they may have up to 30 or 40 different bits of historical evidence, which as a group they cull down to an agreed number. I often say 5. They have to cull it down to 5 bits of historical evidence which they want to include and then cite in the essay that they're going to write. And this is where the debate happens, because each one understands just a little bit different aspect of what we're talking about, of our Constitution, the struggles of getting Quebec to sign it, Meech Lake Accords, Charlottetown Accords, the decision by Elijah Harper to stall it out. And so they come with these bits, and this is where this debate comes in, and it's wonderful to sit and listen to them, because they have to come to some sort of agreement, because ultimately the group is going to create a thesis which they will then write an essay upon. They go home, they write their essays, they come back and they do a peer edit. But in the peer edit, the groups have left with a thesis. And as they've left with a thesis, they've spun the essays in subtly different ways based upon the research that they started off doing. And when they come back, they see how other people would have spun the information to fit their research position. And this is really getting at the historical empathy, where they get to understand that people with a different context come to different conclusions and will make different decisions. And again, the debate ensues where they begin to argue who they think took the better position. They peer review the edits, they hand the essays in, and they produce some of the best essays that I've read in my career, that I think would be at home in a second year university class quite easily. Now, why do we get to this point? And what's the real point? And I love to call it the gray areas or ambiguity. And when I was coming up with this presentation, I came up with this quote that students often find themselves studying similar historical paradigms in any classroom that they're in. However, due to need prior knowledge, they explore the paradigm with an individual understanding of the historical context. Whatever classroom you're in, wherever you are, you're going to have students that are going to come with a different set of historical evidences from their lives and their parents' lives and their histories. And these gaps that they bring in their personal understanding serve to deepen their historical inquiry and lead to this phenomenal further quest of understanding. And so when they go, I came from, say, in my heritage, England, London, but someone came from Manchester, it's not that far away from each other, but we have a different perspective, and we'll often come to different conclusions. And as a country as big as Canada, as you guys can attest, as you're seeing -20 this morning, and I'm complaining because I have this tiny little bit of ice on my windshield and I don't want to step on the bulbs in my garden, we have different perspectives as Canadians. And we bring these different perspectives in. And when we head all back, say, to Ottawa and sitting in the House of Commons and listening to these people talk, they all have a different perspective. I share a story with you that last year when I was back in Ottawa for a conference, I was talking with a Bloc WWII member, and we're having a great conversation. And as we're talking, we kind of looked at each other and said, you know, some of the things that we're talking about from a political point of view, they're very similar from Quebec, from the West Coast. Yet we're thousands of miles apart. And do we really listen to each other, or do we understand? And from that moment on, it was like, I really need to listen to what you guys are saying rather than just speaking what I want to be heard. For me, that was a bit of empathy right there. Now, one of the thesis that came out of the group was this idea that in its quest for its proclaimed rights, Quebec has become a province of conflicted desires, bold demands, and volatile politics. The students can take this thesis in so many different directions and produce essays that are a joy for me to read because they're all a bit different, but will be based upon not only their personal context, but the historical inquiry they did in our text rendering process to produce some really, really powerful essays that begin to empathize with the politicians in Canada. I know out west, many people say, well, you know, why didn't Quebec just sign? They have a position. Until you understand their context, you're not going to understand the decisions they made. Why did Elijah Harper make the decision he made? You have to understand the context they come from. And in a country as big as Canada, that can be a real challenge. Now, the second example that we use is take a look at World War II. Kids love World War II. They love to get into it. They love to talk about it. And what we want them to do is to try and put themselves in the position of the people who had to send young men off to war and all the implications that come with that, but also the decisions that they have to make at home. And to do this, we said, well, how do you decide as a politician what merits attention and what doesn't, and ultimately what is significant to Canada and Canada's war effort? And so in this one, they have to seek out what a definition of significance could be, where they have to come up with that definition themselves. Now, how do they do that? They research the decisions that are being made that Canada that was involved in. It could be from sending over our men right away. It could be the vote taken in the House of Commons. It could be the decision to take part in the WWII, the campaign in Italy, or it could be the decision to conscript soldiers and, you know, the events that happened at home during the war. Now, all these research are skills that we have told you they already have, and they're honing those skills. They're continuing to hone those skills. And they come in with their ideas, and we begin conversations in class where they get to discuss and debate with their peers what were really the important aspects of the Canadians' war efforts. Can you apply a hierarchy to them? How would you apply a hierarchy to them? And with this refinement of their debate, they get to reflect on it. And as they reflect on this idea, they begin to define an understanding of significance. And at this point, today I stumbled across a quote by Henri Poincaré that I think really fits it in this moment. So I want to share it with you guys. The quote goes, "To doubt everything or to believe everything are two equally convenient truths. Both dispense with the necessity of reflection." And that quote really struck at the core of what I'm talking about here today, is that I'm wanting these kids to make a choice and make a decision, and then after they've defined their role of significance, I want them to justify it, and then I want to them apply their knowledge. And by applying this knowledge, the students really have to defend themselves. It's not unlike when they go into university, if they go that route, that they'll be looking at having to produce research, come up with conclusions, and then defend their positions. And they really struggle with this one. They enjoy it, but they do say that it is a struggle, and they produce some really interesting works. And one of the presentations was the image that you will see was a young girl who reworked Maclean's magazine to reflect the events that she thought were significant, one of them being conscription. And by applying this idea, when they apply it, they get to put out to the world, this is how I chose. And we have a bit of a fair where the kids come around and see, and they can see all the different ways that they chose to define significance, how they chose to evaluate and then ultimately rank Canada's war efforts, and they all have a different order and a different way of doing it. And as a teacher, it's just wonderful to see this one. And the things that come in as influences are often their personal histories. Because someone who was living, say, as my ancestors did in London, would see a war in Europe much different than one of my students who lived in China, or one of my students who lived in the Philippines, or some of my students that lived in Africa. They'd have this personal history that comes in, and it starts to come into this bit of a personal bias, that their empathy for their ancestors begins to creep into it. And it's fun to ask them questions, is, did they evaluate themselves as a source? Ultimately, this leads to an open-ended inquiry that allows them to take this project anywhere that they want to go, but it does require a series of questions to drive the process. And this is something that we get way back in the grade 9 years, where they build driving questions, they refine driving questions, and they evaluate their questions to see if they're actually asking good questions that will take them where they want to go, versus just answering a basic question of, where did they fight and when did they fight? We want to get at is, why did they fight? And more importantly, as in this topic, is, why did the people send them there to fight on these areas? And all this comes out in the idea of a personal rationale, where they decide or they defend the decisions that they made. And this is a key aspect in the project, is they have to come up with a definition of significance of how they're going to rank Canada's war efforts, but they also have to defend that decision in a rationale. And all of these things bring a wonderful research vehicle that gives you a personal inquiry platform. They get to look at this idea from an internal and an internal point of view, that they have a bias, and the people who make decisions will also have a bias. And so they would have debated and talked about these decisions. It wasn't a historical decision made by one man or woman at one time. It was a group of people talking about and deciding how and when they need to act, and how and when they should send men into combat, and what would the impact of that be, and implications. And it never comes more alive as when we begin talking about the struggles over whether we should conscript Canadians into our armed forces, which opens up wonderful debates, because these guys have researched and they have definitions of significance. We should send soldiers here, but we shouldn't send them there. We should do this before we should do that. And it opens up just fabulous debates within our classrooms, which carry over into all aspects of my courses, and ultimately into other courses. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples of what students came up with for significance. These are pulled out of the Governor General's package. It's significance when used to rank Canada's wartime contribution is based not on the events, not only on the events event affected during the war, but also on its role in Canada and the world once the war ended. So an event has to actually have a life beyond the war. And an example could be the Manhattan Project that sends us into a nuclear age, or some of Canada's policies on immigrations at the start of the war, or the legacy of conscription. Another one that was put forward, significance is established based on how an event contributed to the total war effort rather than the success of an individual battle or campaign. So they're looking at what did it contribute to actually bringing the war to a conclusion. And these debates, these significance are allowed into the classroom to open up debate. And the students bring these in and they begin talking, and they can sometimes get quite heated, which is wonderful to see the passion rise, that they say, but my definition is more significant than yours. And then they begin talking about significance and ultimately go, how can any one of us decide which is more significant? And the real answer is you can't. But you look at the context that that definition came from, and why did you go that way with your definition when someone went another way? And that conversation is a wonderful one to be a part of. Alrighty, now to summarize coming into it, and as we look at the time that I'm at, ultimately what these projects do is allow our historical debate and historical inquiry to step into the realm of what's known as authentic education, which includes three main things: rigor, relationships, and relevance. And this is what's at the heart of my teaching practice, and it has been for my entire career. I didn't know it for a while. I didn't know there was labels to it until I was a few years in and found out, oh, this is what I'm doing. And it allowed me to begin to hone what I love about teaching is the rigor, and rigor is not quantity or severity. It's complexity, ambiguity, provocation, and emotionally challenging issues. And let my passion spill over to my colleagues in the program that we have, where now we all are working in these areas in different ways, because many of us define this authentic rigor in different ways. So we have great debates ourselves. I guess we're looking at significance as the kids are as well. But we take a look at this rigor and say, how deeply can we take the kids? And we know this, that the ship that they're building these planks out of have to be made with relationships. And we have to link links within and between the curricula. And as we said, we're linking in our grade 9, we have a project that links all of our 4 major curricular organizers of math, science, social studies, and English. They're all linked together by these relationships that are built. We also know, if we really want to take them deep, they have to understand or begin to try to understand the context that the people they're studying came out of. And that's where they're building that historical empathy to build, I guess, historical relationships with people that are long dead. And then the last piece of the puzzle, which is really important to me and to the kids, is the relevance. It has to have a relevance to their lives, their passions, and their talents. And whereas a debate on the Canadian Constitution in the 1980s might not be something that they think is they're passionate about, but understanding the nuances of that realpoliks that comes into it is something that they always love to sink their teeth into, that these people actually were making really difficult decisions based upon the context that they were living in at the time, and they begin to work themselves backwards through the relevance to the relationships back into the rigor, where they say, I don't know enough to judge these people. By saying that when these kids begin to realize that they have this, they find something relevant to their lives, and they know, they start to build the relationships, they bring the rigor themselves, and they begin to take themselves deeper into a topic, because they say, for me to understand how a man or a woman 100 years ago could justify the decision that they made, I need to know more about the context that that decision was made in, which will hopefully build over to them being more empathetic to people in history, and ultimately being more empathetic to the people that they're living with now in the world they're in now. So I guess to summarize, I want to take them deep. I want them to build relationships, and I want them to build relevance. So when they leave our program, they have built themselves a ship that can take them anywhere they want to go. They know how to ask a question, they know how to research, and they know how to take themselves deeply on whatever journey they might want to go on. That ends my chat. And you can see a little bit of the bio on me. And at the bottom there, the important part is my email address, afrench@sd61.bc.ca, where I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions if you don't come up with questions tonight on this one. You guys can read over a bit about me, and you can come and check our school, Mount Doug, on the website. Look at that one. And then I just put a couple of pictures on there, which is... I personally like the one of me as Isaac Brock back there because he has better hair than I do. But that's what wraps up my talk. And at this point, I guess I'm happy to see if you guys have any questions.
Thanks again, Adrian. It confirms everything I believe in when teaching history, and the tips and tools that my history teachers definitely missed out on through my education, grade school and a bit of high school, and speaking to university just changed my world. I did have a few questions. I'll start off tonight. You say debate is very significant part of learning, and because you mentioned the debate gets pretty heated, and I know from previous debates that um, emotions are drawn out, and then you respond in unruly ways sometimes. Do you have rules for debate for your students in your class?
Um, Guidelines, we would say. When we debate in class, we're not in a formal debate setting. And when the students do, and the debates get heated, it is a respect of each other that we've set up. And because these kids are in a cohort model, it has its pros and cons because these kids are stuck together for 4 years. So if you have that one classmate, which we've all had that kind of grates on you, you might have that temptation to really, cut them down with a point. But we ask that the students don't do that you express your opinion, and once you've expressed your opinion, you back away. You can actually put your ideas out there, let them hang out there, and then when someone wants to have a question, rather than attack it, why not use your research to say, but have you thought about this? Or, I don't know if I agree with that, I see it this way, and then because they've been doing research, they can pull in their research and Lucien Bouchard in 1982 said this, and it actually builds on everyone's understanding, including my own, because I'll have 30 kids in front of me having conversations, having done research that's completely different one kid to the next. So I get to learn all this information, which is a pleasure for me. But when it gets heated, I step in and say, we stop down. Sometimes we get to the point where it gets really heated, and we'll do something like a Socratic circle, where a group in the middle put their opinion out, and it's out there for everyone to comment on, and then they walk back, they step out of the inner circle, and then people comment, and they go through a cycle like that, and that allows open debate in a safe environment. Because, Jessica, you're right, it can get heated, and we don't want people to shut down. And as a teacher, the one thing we don't want is, that quiet student in a classroom who has done great research, you've read her work, she has lots to say, and she doesn't want to put her head up because she doesn't want to be shouted down. So we say, no, speak your mind. And sometimes, if I say to students, if you really don't want to speak your mind, you can have a proxy speak. You can write your ideas down, and I'd be happy to be your proxy, or someone else could be your proxy too. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Do you assess these debates to grade your students?
I tend not to, and it's nice to see that they understand it. But generally, what happens is you get people who do like speaking in a crowd, and they go out, and so they would be the ones grabbing the A's. And you have people who are introverts, and they don't really want to speak. So what I do is I'll give them the A, B's, and C's for the work they do, and in the case of the essays, we'll go through and mark the essay. But what I then go up to students and say, just one-on-one, saying, your opinions are really good. It'd be nice to hear them out in class. And they're valid, and they're well-researched, and they belong out in the world with everyone else. And depending on the student, they may venture out and say yeah, they'll put their opinions out there, but not. I often will see kids and it's on the tip of their tongue, and you come on, John, I know it's in you, but I never want to make kids speak, and I wouldn't want to put them in a position where they have to debate formally on a topic that they love, but they're terrified. It would take the pleasure out of the topic. So I don't assign grades to the debate unless we actually would set up a formal debate, and then we could have a set of criteria and rules for that. But I'd rather have kids internalize it and share it when they feel comfortable. And that's the teaching philosophy I've had for much of my career.
Thanks, Adrian. Tanya asks, how do you give individual marks for group essays?
So Tanya, what the kids do, say they're in a group of 4, the only real work that's a group product is the thesis of the essay. They then individually go off and write essays that are unique to themselves, and as I said, they all have a different understanding or context that they were, when I use the text rendering, they have bits and pieces that they bring together. It's kind of like an incomplete jigsaw puzzle. And so they have individual essays that they will hand in. And how I mark that is I use a rubric that marks looking at different characteristics of the essay. And for this assignment, it generally tends to be I'm looking at their understanding of the context and the concepts of history, as well as the writing aspects of it. So I separate those two out for them. So they're getting individual marks. It's not really a group essay. It's a bit of a misnomer. It's a group thesis, which they then write about and defend the thesis, creating individual essays. Does that help you out, Tanya? I guess 10. Yeah, you go. Okay, you're welcome, Tanya.
While everybody else is thinking, I did have another question for you, Adrian.
Okay.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned exposing your students to primary sources in grade 9, is what you said?
Grade 9 and 10, yeah.
Okay, I was wondering, and you mentioned the whole process of learning how to ask a question of these primary sources and of history. And I'm wondering if oral history ever comes into play in this education, and if you are teaching these students how to ask a question of a person who is also technically a primary source to this history.
Yes, we do. In grade 9, the students are given an explorer or someone who moved about Canada in the time periods from 1600 to 1800. And this is where they're asking questions of people in the past. In grade 10, they take that skill and they begin to research someone who came to Canada, and it's a spectacular project that I've worked with a man named Ted Meldrum, where the kids just get a latitude and longitude, a sex, maybe an occupation, maybe an age, and we know people of this ilk came to Canada from somewhere, and they're scattered across the world. And as they work through that project, they have driving questions to ask, which they've learned the skill in grade 9. They ask driving questions, and each stage of the project takes them through a different aspect of the research process, understanding primary, secondary sources, looking at bias, looking at proximity, looking at how to corroborate sources. And in the final stage we've added in is we ask them to go out and talk to people. And we ask them to go to talk to people when all right, I'm back again. Sometimes they go out when they get to the final stage that we go out and ask them to talk to people, and they say, but I'm actually talking to a person versus pulling something from a book and say it's a different set of questions. It has to be flexible. It has to be asking at the heart of the matter, and you have to also take these questions for the context that they're given and evaluate them as you would any other primary source. And the best example I can give you is a young girl who was going out and she was going to buy a old violin for her presentation. Her character card gave her a Métis, and she was going to look for this violin and her presentation was going to be played some Métis music. And she went out and she found a violin on Used Victoria. She went up to this place and the guy asked her, "What do you want my beat up old violin for? It doesn't really play much. It's not good." And she's told him the exploration, and he goes, "I'm Métis." And at that moment, she stopped and she started interviewing him. And when she came back, she said, "I was able to create questions on the spot that actually drove my presentation further, that what I need to go further." And it was wonderful to have those skills. So there is the overlap from the grade 9. And since that experience, we've actually added in a component. Okay, so you're asking a person a question, and we've begun to develop that so we can bring the oral histories in. There you go. That answer your question, Jessica?
Absolutely, Adrian. That is a fabulous answer, and your schools and yourself are doing fabulous work. I'm thoroughly impressed. Every time I speak to one of our former GG winners, I'm astounded and just always so impressed by the work that's being done in high schools today. thank you for presenting tonight, and thank you everybody for coming out. If there are no final questions, I would like to call tonight's webinar complete.
Tanya is typing, I have.
Yes.
Oh,
You're welcome.
you're very welcome, Tanya. It was my pleasure.
All right. All right. Thank
All
you
right.
everybody for coming out. And I will be sending out the survey in the next 20 minutes. So watch your inboxes. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Good night.
Good night.